So welcome to the HKUST Library Scholarly Communication and Digital Humanities Seminar. Tonight it will be, this afternoon it will be given by Michele Petochi, who came all the way from Europe to be with us today. I am Victoria, and I work in the reference section of the library. Our moderator for the afternoon will be Dr. Eden Woon, our Vice President for Institutional Advancement, and he'll also make some opening remarks. As I mentioned to the early comers, please help yourself to some refreshments. They're in the back. Now, before we start, just a few words about Mr. Petochi. He is currently the Managing Director for Venice for the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, the EPFL. He's the Senior Advisor to the President and Secretary General on the strategy for EPFL in digital science, digital humanities, and other important areas and partnerships. Prior to EPFL, Michele was a fellow at the World Economic Forum, where he created the Global University Global University Leaders Forum. He has an academic background in humanities and has previously also worked in international development. So now our moderator for the afternoon, Dr. Woon, will say a few words. Dr. Woon.
Thank you, Victoria. I have to tell you that this event is probably one of the most enjoyable that I'm looking forward to in my 4 years here at Hong Kong UST. First of all, on the personal front, Michele, we've known each other for over 4 years now, and when he was at the World Economic Forum, our university made connection with the World Economic Forum, and so we progressed in our relationship so that just 2 weeks ago, our university sent a team to Davos in Switzerland to the annual conference of the World Economic Forum. And we had a 4-faculty team to present an ideas lab on merging reality and virtual and reality. And Professor Pascal Fung was one of the 4 members of the team. And of course, our president, Professor Tony Chan, who unfortunately has a lunch with the government. He can't cancel. So he cannot come today. But he, of course, is a member of this Global Universities Leaders Forum that Michele has set up. So our presence and connection with World Economic Forum is intimately related to Michele here. Secondly is that the topic, anytime there's interdisciplinary, that excites me personally, because I think the world is not physics, is not chemistry, is not biology, but the world is everything. And all the challenges of the world can only be tackled through a combination and cooperation of many, many disciplines. So he's going to talk about digital humanities. And I see Professor Yang Chang, there's a seat here for you. Please come up. Okay. He's another member of the team that went to Davos. He's a department head of computer science engineering department, or ECE. He's the head of, CSE, right, CSE. Please, the guy. And he also went to Davos, and you can see why. It was the slopes of Davos.
This is what happens in Davos.
Seriously? But anyway, the digital humanities, exciting subject, combines big data and humanities and a variety of other disciplines. I read the description of what Michele sent me. The only thing I can say is that I got very excited, but I didn't understand what I read. So I just know there is excitement in there. So anyway, why don't I just stop here and let Michele tell you what he has in mind. He's from EPFL, which is one of the strategic partners of Hong Kong UST. We have a very close relationship with them, and it's fitting today that he's coming here to give us, especially coming here to give us this talk. Michele, let's give a big hand to Michele Petochi.
Thank you, Eden. Wow, thank you everyone for being here. It's really an honor for me to be at HKUST, a university that, as Eden said is very close to our hearts and minds, and especially at the level of our professors, many of whom are involved with you in projects. Not yet with Venice, actually, but my job at EPFL at the moment is not so different in a sense from what I was doing at WEF, which is about getting excited about some interesting work of great professors and try to share this excitement with all possible audiences, from potential partners to potential donors, of course, and try to really be a facilitator for my colleagues who are then working on the hard stuff in research and technology transfer. And so we're quite excited to be in Venice. So I would give you a little bit of background about EPFL, which no matter it is a partner of HKUST, maybe not all of you are totally familiar with it. And then I will try to land together with you into what is a really fascinating adventure with a lot of open questions, with a lot of expectations to handle, but that I think is really the beauty of research and the beauty of any project, which might initially sound a bit crazy, but then as you go, might unfold in interesting ways. Right, so how many of you have been to Venice? Stupid question. Okay, not so many, okay. So this is actually a beautiful map of Venice dating from the 16th century. There is one thing that you want to keep in mind as you go through this presentation. Venice is probably the most amazing example of a completely artificial environment. So imagine a group of folks, families that used to live in the countryside of that particular part of northern Italy, who under the pressure, the threat of Attila, who with his horses and hordes was coming from the northeast, literally had to choose between dying on the land or try to survive in the middle of the water, where there was basically nothing. There were a couple of chunks of islands, but all the things that you see, most of the things that you see in Venice are man-made. So it's fascinating because it is a city which started almost as a counterintuition. And if you think about all this, I'm sure you read about the never-ending debates about the future of Venice and the cruise vessels and how to modify the lagoon, and people calling for scandals the moment you suggest to excavate a new canal. Well, guess what? No matter what the opinions are, at the end of the day, Venice is a totally man-made artificial environment. And even though this is not the topic of my presentation, keep it in mind as you try to dive into the lagoon. But back to back to places which are close to the water, like here, everything started here on the Lake Léman, Lake Geneva, and this is EPFL. It is a relatively young university, actually. We are about 40 years old, and started by virtue of an act of the federal government that, long story short, decided to sustain education, research, and tech transfer for some of the leading institutions in Switzerland. There was ETH, that I'm sure you know, which is where Albert Einstein studied, and everybody already knows that. And there was a good but nothing special engineering school in the French part of Switzerland, in Lausanne, here, where there was nothing. And this is now EPFL, which has become a very remarkable and very international player in the academic world. Funny enough, some of you might know that Venice used to be a huge factory of vessels, of ships. There is an arsenal in Venice where vessels were used to be made. Actually, the surface of EPFL is more or less the same as the surface of the arsenal, and it took us 40 years to become as big as that. Just a quick few numbers. We are a community of about 15,000 individuals, about 10,000 students, 300 plus faculty, a fairly vibrant environment in terms of spin-offs, especially relatively to the European standards. a good level of investment. We have obviously a great endowment from from the federal government, which is complemented by an increasing amount of other public funding, especially European funding, which are the most competitive of all, and private donations. So it's a very actually interesting university, plus with a bit of a crazy touch, in the sense that, and I'm still getting familiar with my university. You know, I've joined them a year ago, but the crowd at EPFL, it looks very quiet, but then they come up with very crazy projects. So a few years ago, some of you might know, the idea of creating a Swiss boat for the America's Cup started at EPFL. There were good ideas, there were good resources from Bertarelli, and they won actually 2 America's Cup. They also made the fastest sailing boat ever built. Some of you might have seen a solar airplane flying around in the last few years. And then in terms of interesting works, this building, which is called the Rolex building, built by, designed by Kazuyo Seijima, who won the Pritzker Prize, has literally changed the face of the campus, which was until then a fairly boring campus in the middle of the Swiss countryside. And people now come visiting us. So just to give you, a little bit of background as to where I come from, but then why we ended up in Venice, we ended up in Venice because we think Venice is a synthesis of a number of problems, and all these problems interact in very contradictory ways. So I don't know if those of you who've been to Venice have seen this sculpture, which used to be at the foundation of François Pinault a few years ago, and big scandal. So half of the population literally wanted to go with a hammer and destroy this sculpture because they thought it was altering the image of the city and the lagoon. And this is, for me, a small symbol of the level of tension that you experience in a place like Venice, where you have to imagine that you have a population that has been living on a boat basically for 1,000 years. Maybe not physically on a boat, but physically in physical conditions which remind a lot on the conditions that you have on the boat, and the codes of conduct that you have to have in order to survive. Just again, to get you to gradually land something very provocative, in the ancient Venice, the crime for wasting water was, as the gravity of that crime was considered the same as the gravity of a murder. So think about living on a boat for 1,000 years. And here is where the humanities come into play. So it's first of all, we think that the humanities are at the core of our identity, especially of our identity as a polytechnical school. So if you think about it, the very way in which we ask our science questions comes from the humanities, from the liberal arts. And that is conceptually very important to us, especially at the moment, Europe is challenged from a political point of view, from a cultural point of view. We have to rediscover that. Secondly, the humanities can be considered, or we like to consider it, then up to we'll see what happens in the next few years, a big data science. And I'll show you some examples as to what we see, what we think that means. And then Venice is potentially the most amazing humanities lab that one can think of, because of its history, because of all the things which are in there, and because, in a sense, because it's a man-made environment, it is, no matter how decadent, it is the city of the future for us. So the humanities about our identity. Here are just 3 examples of, that you can think about when you have to explain why the humanities is so foundational, right? So this is the archives, used to be, unfortunately, the archives of Cologne, the German city. It was actually one of the most important archives of continental Europe, which basically collapsed, including a few casualties. And with kilometers and kilometers of documents from the whole history of Europe, and guess what? It collapsed on top of that into the river. So what you see, I'll just show you quickly all the documents of the archives of Cologne are in this state. I'm not going to elaborate on that, but just to keep in mind in terms of the European identity and the cultural identity. Why I included the Olivetti archive, not just because I'm Italian, but because what is fascinating and interestingly, so what some companies have started to ask us to think about is the importance of mapping the history of know-how. So not just data about what happened in a certain place, but also if you take a company which has been at the source, at the beginning of innovations, which are still continuing today, it is fundamental not to miss all the steps in the evolution of know-how. Otherwise, we cannot understand where how we have got to where we are now. And then there are amazing, amazing archives. The world is plenty of amazing archives, right? And so one that we found amazing and which we got donated is the archive of the Montreux Jazz Festival, which we digitized and which we hope to make available in ways which are as interactive as possible. These are rudimentary examples of a cabin where you can literally enjoy the Montreux Jazz Festival, literally to the point of almost touching Miles Davis as he's singing and sweating on stage. It's early stage, but it is quite fascinating. So as to why the humanities are so important to us. Again, to reinforce the case, Elga Novotny, the former head of ERC, emphasizing the importance of the humanities along with natural science and engineering. A recent beautiful book by Edmund Phelps on the notion of economic dynamism, at the very roots of which he sees the humanities. And so he's pushing for having the humanities included more in the curriculum. And this is a bit more anecdotal. One of the traditional Davos participants, David Rubenstein, a large big investor in the US, and he has this kind of equation, which is like liberal arts or humanities equals more capital. Back to the conditions for which then we think and ask questions. And then let's start to get a bit more into science. One of the ways for us to describe the humanities as a big data science is that, first of all, data is available because there is a level of acquisition which was not possible before. So you can acquire text, you can acquire images, you can acquire objects digitally. And so the research and tech transfer opportunities are increasingly interesting. You can work on digitization technologies, you can work on software and data storage solutions, logistics of large repositories. Just imagine to have to rebuild the entire archives of Cologne. It is like a largest experiment of war surgery, something that conditions that you have never experienced, but that in a way or another you have to recover all that material, no? And so all the questions and new technologies that might emerge from that. And then obviously technologies for what is commonly called immersive experience, Montreux here. And then I'm sure all of you in a way or another are familiar with the increasing number of businesses and projects which have to do with immersive experience, ranging from very basic apps which help you at the level of textual recognition, or at the level of visiting a city, or at the level of enjoying theater in a way which is visually incredible and that you couldn't experience before. Obviously, there are a lot of projects at the level of museums. Yesterday I was in Tokyo. I was actually blown away by the beauty of the visualizations at DMP, which is this very old, remember, history of know-how, one of the oldest printing companies in the world, printing from walls down to semiconductors. And the level of beauty and sophistication these guys are able to reach, for example, in interacting with Louvre, is just mind-blowing. I'm trying to see what else is on the market, but certainly that's a benchmark. And the Smithsonian Institute is also exploring digitization. Retronaut, which got recently acquired by Mashable, is becoming a very fascinating photography archive project. And this is the director of the Vatican Library, who, as you might know, has a project of digitization of manuscripts in collaboration with NTT Data, the subsidiary of NTT in Japan. Now back to EPFL. I don't have to go into the details, but I guess all of you, if you look at this table, will see something that resonates with you. The whole point for us, before we think about the humanities, is that there is an effort at a much more general level for EPFL in thinking about what big data science means concretely. Anecdotally, we observe that, for example, job trends seem to mention more and more this magic word, big data. I guess that some people know what they're talking about, other people don't know, but they like to talk about it. But having said that, there is an effort which goes from students to faculty to the very institutional level in embracing big data science, which is an effort certainly for EPFL, and it's probably an effort and an opportunity for most of the university that collaborate with us. And so in a very simple way, so there is a context which has evolved, so the overwhelming amount of data, you guys know these things much better than I do, and the need and the opportunity to look for new patterns which were not possible, which one could not see before, and something that it seems to be, it's easy in words, but then challenging in practice, right? Because turning the noise of data into something meaningful is something complex. And then there is a very significant level of education that has to be put in place in order to catch up. And catch up means learning individually and also collaborate. For example, our colleagues in computer science have to collaborate in different ways with all the other colleagues from all the other schools. And obviously, if you would ask somebody from the humanities whether it is difficult to collaborate with computer science, the answer would obviously be yes, but don't forget that the answer would be yes probably for all the other schools, including those which have been more naturally working with big data in the last decades. I think this is a good simplification of what kind of students, what kind of talent we want to produce, and it comes from economics, so it doesn't necessarily cover the entire spectrum of science. But I think Susan Athey of Stanford synthesizes who the winners in this adventure will be. And again, this is a way for me to give you a sense of where we are coming from the moment we decide to embrace the humanities as a big data science. This is a snapshot of the strategy of EPFL, which I included to show that for us, working on the humanities is not just a nice to have, but it's something that is becoming very core. Now, if you take a cake of EPFL, you will obviously see that the slice of the humanities is very, very thin, whereas the other slices are much bigger in terms of number of faculty, budget, and so on. But we think that by including the humanities into the strategy would put the right level of pressure on deans and other colleagues to accelerate on the engagement with this area, including faculty hiring, which as fast as it might happen in a dynamic university as EPFL, is something that is not obvious, and the time it takes to hire faculty might be too long vis-a-vis the expectations of your community, like donors and so on. So that's an interesting institutional challenge. At the level of educational offering, what we are working on is essentially our first graduate educational offering in digital science will be related to the humanities. And our kind of assumption to be challenged is that this would be the first master recognizing the humanities as a technological field, with the offering a mix of technical interpretation, modeling courses and projects, and already with pilots ongoing. There is a beautiful summer school that we've started in Venice 2 years ago. I'll be happy, by the way, to give you more information because it's a fun one and it's very open to ideas and people, including laterally from the topics. So I'm not advertising it, but I'm saying that it is a very interesting experience. Plus, it is in Venice, and you have a chance to visit all the most amazing places. So it's something special. Now, to get more, to land again into EPFL, the dream, in a sense, is to start a bachelor, because the bachelor is what is really foundational, and more importantly, through a bachelor, we hope that in the future we will be able to attract different profiles of students across gender and across disciplines. This is for us a priority. And now I'm taking you to Venice. So Venice as a unique humanities lab. This is the Lagoon of Venice. Venice is here. Just thought, it would be nice to land somehow. The blue circle is the area where we usually work, and you will see why. This is the arsenal which I was mentioning. Look at how big it is. And landing further, there are two institutions. One is the National Archives of Venice, Archivio di Stato, and the other one is Ca'Foscari, which is one of the Venetian universities. There is also a pretty important university called the UAV, which is primarily focusing on architecture, which is not officially our partner, but professors, as you know, no matter whether or not partnerships exist, they collaborate if they want, so they also collaborate with us. And this is Ca'Foscari. It is probably the most beautiful president's office in the world. It's straight or bang on Canal Grande, so it's something amazing. And this is the partnership. It's called Digital Humanities Venice, and at the moment it includes Ca'Foscari University, EPFL, the National Archives of Venice, which belongs to the Ministry of Culture of Italy, so it's the Italian government basically, and then the foundation arm of one of the main Swiss private banks, Lombard Odier, who has a foundation, and they were crazy enough to give us some startup funding to jump into this Venice project, which was really, really welcome funding. And this is Frédéric. I'll try to introduce you to people from, people who are still, people from the present, people from the past across this presentation. So it's important to attach, stories to real people. So Frédéric is a French professor, and he's the mind, he's the thinker behind what we call the Venice Time Machine. And you can also watch him on TED. He got 1 million downloads, which is quite remarkable. So he's excellent at selling his idea, which is that essentially the moment data from the past becomes available, which is still not available right now, the way in which history of arts, history of culture will be studied will change. Because it will be possible to make a number of assumptions which are at the moment incredibly weak, much stronger. And so maybe, who knows, the way in which we have been interpreting a certain part of history, or following a certain city, a certain state, or a certain region of the world might change as a function of the availability of new data. But then we'll see, because mining the data is not obvious. Then there is this other professor, Dorit. She's from Venice and Israel, and she's at Ca'Foscari, and she's obsessed with testaments. In Venice, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of testaments. And you will see why there are thousands of this kind of documents. But the key notion that Dorit tries to promote is that if you go from the study of one document to the study of a system of documents, the way in which you study history might change. And actually, her argument is very convincing the moment she starts to give you the details, the nitty-gritty of all these legal documents which are in the archive. Andrea Rinaldo, who is an engineer, is interested in the evolution of the Laguna. He's probably the guy that knows every single corner of the Lagoon of Venice best in the world, and there is a lot of information on the evolution of the Lagoon of Venice, like the first map I showed you, in the archives. So this is another project under this umbrella of that we call Time Machine. Melanie, who is now in Halifax because she's interested in maritime routes, and apparently Halifax is an interesting place to study that, is interested in data from the archive in order to develop algorithms to know more about shipping lanes across the Mediterranean Sea at the time of the Venetian Empire. I assume that all of you know that Venice was not only a city, but was a large commercial empire, literally in touch with the entire world that was known at that time. Isabella is working on something interesting, which at a glance might not look so fascinating. This looks like a standard AutoCAD visualization, but she's trying to make sure that all these visualizations include real data. So this is not just something that is nice visually, but that it is totally informed also from within. so that in what we hope is not a distant future, if you take a whatever date, you know that, for example, on March 25th, 1509, a certain area of Venice, in this case Rialto, which is, by the way, the place to which all the routes of the Empire of Venice ended up, because it was the market. So you will be able to know all the things that happened on the day, who was around, what was inside each house, and so on. It's really interesting, and the data potentially exists. Similarly, you can also associate a particular place at a particular point in time with documents to which are important to that story. Yannick, another colleague, is trying to map networks within the city of Venice, and he thinks that he can create a Facebook of the past. This is how he describes what he's doing. And he's a mathematician initially. Another colleague is working on key groups within a city. So, we know very well that how precious the help of interns is today in companies everywhere, no matter where. Well, guess what? The help of interns in Venice was huge in every, for painters, for all sorts of economic activity, and there is data on that. So when I say based on data, it's because data exists, down to the very nitty-gritty, to the very individual level. So here, this is to introduce you to Battista, who used to be a Venetian ambassador in the 17th century, and we'll find him here and there throughout the rest of the presentation. Now, all the data which I mentioned until 1815 used to be scattered around different locations in Venice. Plus, imagine different locations across the Empire of Venice. Venice used to be a city-state, it was a state, and had ambassadors, spies, and staff all over the world. And then all the data ended up, thanks to a good decision made by the Austrians in 1815, into the Archive of Venice, which is originally a convent, and there is now an archive. Interestingly, you have to think that almost nowhere in the world buildings in which host archives were meant to be built to be archives. Actually, probably one of the few was the Archive of Cologne, which collapsed. And this is the beautiful church and the square where the state archive is. So this is the physical Google. This is the place where you go. You want to search for something about ships, you find something. You want to find about the fauna of a lagoon, you find it. About the price of fish in the market, you find it. It's really like Google, only it is physical, it smells, it's fascinating. And you can find all sorts of, I'm trying to get you excited because this is, so I think it's also my job to get other people excited. So I give you a few examples of documents which are in this kind of archive. So this is a letter to a lawyer by the daughter of Marco Polo, who at the death of her husband obviously wanted her endowment back. As you know, at that time, the family, when the daughter got married, also gave the endowment to the family of the husband, but then when the husband passed away, they wanted the money back. So this is Marco Polo's daughter asking for the money back. This is, guess what? This is Galileo Galilei, who thought that he was able to invent something allowing to see vessels coming from afar in order for the city of Venice, which was a military state, to see if enemies were swinging by, and he was asking for research funding for that. And this document is in the archive. This is the beautiful map that you saw. There are many of these maps. This is so this is not a bamboo forest, but it's actually the cadastre. So all the maps of the region of Venice still exist. Many of them are still consulted, and this was created by Napoleon, who, as you may know, had a very mixed experience with Venice. So the Venetians, if there is somebody they hate, that's Napoleon. Nevertheless, they found this way of organizing the space very useful, and so it is still used officially in legal documents. There are treaties. In this case, this was a treaty between Venice and the Grand Duke of Tuscany. As you may remember, Italy until the 1860s was divided into many states. And so there were always treaties and other agreements. This is even more important. There are countries in the world that, in order to study their own history, they have to go to the archives of Venice. And one of these countries is Turkey. Another one is Greece. So there is a collection of documents in the Archive of Venice which is called Documenti Turchi, which is the most amazing collection of information about the history of a country. Battles all over. This was a battle against the Turkish by a description by a Venetian general. And this is maybe the most interesting one. So look at this document. So remember, Venice was a city-state, a military state trading with the world over in a permanent status of risk management. This was a dispatch by a spy, basically, from Constantinople, and it's encrypted. And you know what? We still don't know what's in it. And so imagine that you have, I'm serious, imagine that you have like 20,000 documents of this kind. The moment you manage to digitize and to search through them, maybe it could be history, it might be helpful to study history of cyber risk. We don't know. But so it's really, when I say it is a physical Google, I really mean it. I'm told no. I'm trying to find out, but apparently nobody knows what this means. Yeah, we can work on it. And I think John Maida synthesized this very well. He heard a little bit about the story, the project we're working on. When you study Venice, you study the world. Venice was in a permanent state of risk management and recorded everything. But think about recorded everything because it is true. They recorded everything. And you know what the problem is? They recorded really everything. So think about these three numbers: 80 kilometers, 2.5 billion pages, 1,000 years of history, and then the keyword system of document. So these four things. And then we take friends to the archive because we want to raise the profile and to get feedback. And so one of the last visits a few months ago was by Stephen and Rami Greenblatt. Stephen is a professor at Harvard. Some of you might have read his books. He's one of the foremost experts in Shakespeare. And then Klaus, my former boss at WEF, I convinced him to visit the archive as he was in Venice, so it was a fun visit. And what Stephen said, which is anecdotal, but I think is fascinating, said by him, is that if all this material becomes available and searchable, the way we do research might change. So consider this. You have a historian usually studies one or few documents. This historian of the future might study 5,000 of these documents. So back to the idea of system of documents. And so if we were able to compute all this data somehow, that would help dig much deeper into history and include perspectives, nuances. So this is, I guess it starts to give you an idea of what kind of dream, what kind of crazy project this could become. These are kind of obvious audiences. Some of you might be familiar with the work of historians like Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie, who essentially tried to reconstruct the history of climate, history of health, based on data from prices in the market, travel logs, and so on. There is a whole tradition of research in Europe, and we think certainly those kind of scholars would benefit from that. And then we don't know. There are a lot of opportunities that we still, we still have to explore. Okay, so assuming the all I've said somehow makes sense, which you're free to think it doesn't, but what I want to focus on is how to make the data available. So let's try to jump into a bit more into the technology aspect. So how to integrate all the records regarding, for example, Battista over, in 80 kilometers of documents. And so the Venice Time Machine aims to address this kind of question by structuring the information from all these records, transforming these archives into a digital information system. There is one thing which is very important. What you see here, which is the backstage of the Archives of Venice, is a very well-kept and managed archive. So we are not talking about a place which is a crazy repository of stuff everywhere. It is a very well-organized repository which works as an archive. So you go to the desk, you ask for a document, and they give it to you actually quite quickly. But if you think about digital acquisition of all that is in the archive and creating an information system, that could really revolutionize the way in which we deal with data from the past. And this archive is really an interesting lab. It's quite unique. 3 challenges. So the first challenge is the digitization of all documents. The second challenge is semi-automatic transcription of handwritten documents, probably the most complex one. And third, data mining and structured data. At some point, if you have to do a search, the data has to be in some sort of database. There is also, yesterday in Tokyo, somebody said that there is also a problem of storage. Yes, maybe it's not the main challenge, but let's see, there is also a fourth one that has to do with storage. And let me give you a quick education, a quick overview of where we stand. No, we EPFL, where society stands with digitization of documents. So there is, on one side of the spectrum, there is digitization of single fragile objects. So like the beautiful map and the Turkish document. And that is possible. It is a bit expensive, but it is feasible. And it is done everywhere in the world. So there is nothing particularly revolutionary about it. If you want to digitize one volume, you have good scanners available these days, and you can do the job. If you have to digitize a map, there are planetary scanners which allow you to do that. Beautiful, anything incredibly innovative? No, not so much. On the other side of the spectrum, you have mass digitization of material which is not fragile. That is also possible. Imagine in this case the digitization of the Montreal Gazette. That is something similar to Google Books. These documents are not fragile, they are not so heterogeneous, they're kind of okay. So it's something, as long as you have some resources, you can do it. And actually, I'll show you one, because in the interest of time, maybe it's, I might be running late, but I'll show you, there are scanners which are amazing. So if the material is not fragile, let's see if it appears. It's here. Away. I can see it here, but let me see. Anyway, yeah. Oh, okay. Let's see. Okay. Yeah. Great. Sorry about that. Let me take it back. Okay. So this is a scanner assembled by the University of Tokyo, and it can do 200 pages a minute. If you use this kind of scanner in the Venice archive, you probably get arrested. But isn't it beautiful just to watch? It's kind of, but this is just for aesthetics that I'm showing this, because it doesn't work for our archives, unfortunately. So let's go back to the presentation. But And the others are also beautiful. One has a robotic finger that turns the pages. The other one can kind of blow up the pages vertically. It's very fascinating. Okay, but how about large, fragile, and heterogeneous corpora? Let's go back to our archive. Look at this. If you imagine that you are on a table long from here to there, and you have 15 different typologies of documents, it's sort of a wine tasting. It's incredible. If you love archives, it is the most beautiful experience you can have, and please visit us in the Archive of Venice if you want to come to Venice. So how about the 80 kilometers, the 2.5 billion pages, and so on? Would a full digitization ever be possible? And so, because our engineers are very meticulous, they said, okay, let's start by doing an inventory. So we created a small team inside the Archive of Venice, and what they did over the last 6 to 8 months is an inventory. So they took every single typology of document from the Venice archive and they ran tests on each of those typologies to know how long it takes to scan this and that and under what assumptions, what constraints, and how much it would cost. And so this is Giovanni. And they were able to do a bit of math, which is nice, at least to get a sense of the order of magnitude. So if you were crazy enough that you would be willing to digitize the entire archive of Venice, or an archive like the one of Venice, and if you would have 25 machines like these, 50 colleagues working with you, and 99 years, it would cost you in the range of 250 million. Now, if you are interested in this kind of maths, I can also show you a couple of other scenarios, but in general, and as a function of number of people working on it, or number of machines, or both, the cost of the potential digitization of the entire archive is between 250 and 450. So almost nonsense. Because remember, it is feasible, but there is no innovation. And if you're a university, at the end of the day, you don't want to end up as an office of digitization. That is not your job. At the same time, which we think is a very noble job to do, especially on the short term, back to the expectations, is, there is a number of collections which are very important, either because they are highly consulted or because they're very fragile, or for whatever reason they are a priority. Maybe some of them are small collections, but easier for machines to read, and so you can provide with a proof of concept much more quickly. We said, okay, there is a reasonable project that we can do nevertheless, so no matter new technologies available, at a cost which is in the range of a few million. So if you want to digitize what you could call a golden set of collections from a kind of archive like that is feasible. The only challenge is to find 3 or 4 million, something like that. And you would be successful in the sense that the impact on the Venetian scholarly community would be significant, because the moment you help them better use that material, that per se is already a very good achievement. Now, innovation, no, but it is useful. And so, let me get you to the frontier in acquisition. So, 3 things. Speed has to go up, damage has to be almost zero, and cost has to go down. So, how we do it today is like this. You take the book, you put it under the scanner, you need a human being to turn the pages, and this is what we believe maybe one day the future will look like. And there is this colleague, Fausia, who whose point is that if you do an MRI to a book or to an ancient document, it's pretty much the same as if you do an MRI to a chest. Frequency of the rays might have to be different and so on, but she's testing that on books. And you know what is funny is that not so many people have been thinking about it until a while ago. We're not the only ones who've been thinking about it, but not so many. So this is something relatively new, and actually relatively easy to test with machines which are conventional. So it's an interesting testing phase. You can actually also use the synchrotron. The only shortcoming of the synchrotron is that the beams of particles that you can use at the synchrotron are very small. So you cannot, it's a bit useless if you try to do the synchrotron with an A4 format or a larger one. So this is primarily through conventional X-ray. And one key thing, there has to be iron in the inks, at least for now. And we are lucky enough that most of the documents in Venice archives, because they are antique, contain good amounts of metal. So that makes the tests meaningful. And this is what you see. So this is the yellow one is what you see if you look at the page. And this is what you see after X-ray. This is what you see in section, and this is what you see, normal view and tomography. It's not so easy to see, but I think you can see something. And so the idea, this kind of crazy idea, is to open these books virtually at some point. So you do the MRI, and then through a software, you unfold them. There is one footnote which could be a physical problem, so that means a killer assumption. That for volumes which are too thick, that might not be possible. We are still testing that. Fausia is still testing that. Nevertheless, no matter that might be an unsolvable problem, if you can already do something good with thickness, which is maybe 20, 30, 40 pages, there are millions of documents in archives like the one of Venice and archives everywhere in the world which you can acquire, and it could be interesting already that. So that is first challenge, the digitization. Now the second challenge, which is somehow more complex. So once you've scanned, how you make it available. And that has to do with machine learning. So one of the interesting results of the tests was the following. Actually, the cost of digitization is high. We expected that. What we expected, but not that high, was the cost of detailed, sorry, the focus is not good, but of the detailed description of the documents we were running tests on. So there is a cost of production of metadata which is incredibly high, to the point of potentially killing this kind of projects. Because as beautiful as it might be to put all these documents online, one thing is to put one single very important document online that everybody recognizes as an important document, so the metadata exists by the very nature of the importance of the document. But if you have to put 5,000 of these documents online and do something out of them because you think that you can look at that you can run an economic study out of the list of the price of the fish in the market, well, if you have to describe 5,000 of those documents, I would challenge you in finding the funding for that. Description of these documents imply that you have to be relatively a professional in order to do it. So the cost of the workers would be very high because they would have to be qualified. And so to bring the cost down, machine should learn fast. And these are, projects in software development that probably some of you are, much more up to speed with than I am. But there are different steps, starting from binarization to content extraction, and then to content classification, in order ultimately to have a database which is good enough to allow for semi-automatic transcription. The human element will never go away, but we think that some good progress can be made. So binarization is important because you have to clean up the document. Let's not forget that these documents exist and they are in relatively good state, but it doesn't mean that they are in good state ready for being digitized or for being read by a machine. And then you have to pre-filter. You have first to teach the machine how to see these things on the page as images, and then you have to teach the machine how to read these things as words, and that's not obvious. And then you will have to be able to basically to process the textual content with a good semi-automatic transcription tool, and that would help you improve the digital version of the documents. So this is just an example of a word. If the word is recurring, at some point the machine learns that, and that information goes into the database. This is a snapshot of, if you have to explain or to get a sense of where we stand with the software today versus what the software might be able to do. Essentially, the key of the future software will be the automatic recognition, and that implies that machines will have learned pretty well in the first phase. Ultimately, the idea is to have a database. Interestingly, if you already want to show some results, imagine that you select just a few collections of the archive like Venice and collections which are not so difficult to digitize and not so difficult to read. You really don't need too many, a huge amount of metadata to show the proof of concept of what you want to do. So in terms of low-hanging fruits, what we're trying to prioritize is types of documents which are not so difficult in order to show that this can be done. And ultimately, a database can be created. So back to Battista, just very quickly. So imagine you search for Battista Nani, what you would be able to see in the future, starting from Battista's birth act, and then looking at the other members of his family, and then associating him to another document or vice versa. You can search by document or by person. Maybe another document which also relates to other people in Venice. Don't forget that the Venetians were obsessed with taking note of everything because they were obsessed with taxes. So most of the documents that you find in the archives are because the more you keep track, the better you can calculate taxes. And guess what? Taxes in Venice, everybody used to pay them, and they were very low. So it was a very efficient system. They were about 10%. And they were kind of crazy about it. Again, this is another, exactly. So decime means tenth, and this means 10%. So this was essentially the annual fiscal declaration. When marriages took place in Venice, the notaries, they cross-checked with the parish churches down to the very things that went from one to another house, down to there are documents which document that certain shares went from one to another house, just to give you a sense of the granularity, of the obsession of the Venetians with taking notes, and so on. So back to the idea of the Facebook of the past, or of this kind of, giant graphs. Our dream is to make this possible for the Venice archives, and potentially for any other interesting archive, and potentially, which is maybe one day the most interesting thing, to link them up in order to have really a huge global database of historical data. I think it's a bit pompous to call it DNA of culture, but I use it to give you a sense of the amount of information. We have several goals. I'm not going into details into this because I would love to get your, to gather questions. The main challenge at the moment is on the short term. So we have to get to proof of concept over the next 2 to 5 years. At the same time, we can assemble a good network of people. We can start to form interesting talent through the educational offering. We can show some degree of economic impact through maybe patents in visualization, spin-offs in museum management. We don't know yet, but we argue that we might be able to develop, to have an economic impact. And then on the very long term, I just give you 2 numbers. In the 1950s, the city of Venice, the island, had a population of 150 people. 150,000. Guess the population of today. Pardon me? 30,000? A bit more. 60,000. So, in spite of all the problems that Venice faces, ranging from issues related to tourism and all sorts of things, the very, very point is that Venice is facing a demographic challenge. And it is the demographic challenge of an empire that used to be at the center of the world several centuries ago, and that is now at the very, very end of a tail, which is not even that fat. It's just a very, mager tail. Interestingly, Venice is part of a region where the mainland, no matter the economic challenges, is still fairly wealthy. It is one of the wealthiest regions of Europe. But Venice per se is a place that is kind of dying. And so we think, we and our partners think that maybe one of the ways to revitalize a place like Venice is by virtue of an injection of human capital through, from academia and from all the things that academia can then induce. Economic impact may have to do with certain industries, from creative industries to ads, to movie production, to educational offering, museum industries, and so on. These are just examples. Some industries might be indirectly interesting, but we are for example, we might start to work with banks who are interested in data from the past in order to better understand the evolution of loans. Just to give you one example. This is a bit more granular. We looked at the marketing technology as one industry, and so all the macro areas and specific competencies and specific tasks. I don't go into this. What I just want to stress is that what we are trying to do has to have some sort of economic impact. Otherwise, the risk of ending up in a project which is totally extravagant is very high, especially at an economic conjuncture in a country like Italy, where we have 43% youth unemployment in some areas. So there is not, you cannot land in Venice and start to talk about the digitization of archives. It's not necessarily a priority. Nevertheless, we think it's interesting. This is the last one. These are the challenges that remain. So the scientific prospect has to be credible. Believe me, there are challenges externally, but there are also challenges internally. So if you have to sell this project inside a university like EPFL, that is not obvious. Partly because people are busy, partly because people don't see the point, partly because people see, okay, I love Venice, but I'm not exactly sure what I'm supposed to do. So there is an institutional challenge. We have to show a proof of concept in semi-automatic transcription based on digitization. Visualizations, back to what I was showing of informed visualizations, have to be mind-blowing. Otherwise, these days, you are superseded by other projects. The educational offering has to attract other types of students because diversity is key. There has to be an economic and business prospect, and obviously there has to be some financial sustainability through, for the very management of this large undertaking. I would stop here, and I would welcome questions, and I hope I've opened a few areas for discussion.
This is extremely interesting and fascinating. I hope you agree. So next time we read The Merchant of Venice, we may have a different view on who's the bad guy, who's the good guy.
I forgot to say, 2016 is the 500th anniversary of the creation of the ghetto of Venice, the Jewish ghetto. It is not the birthday, of course, but it is an interesting event, and there is going to be a festival around Shylock, the Merchant of Venice, developed by Steven Grimble.
Okay, good. So let's have some questions here. Okay, we have two professors with questions. Do we have any students with questions? Okay, we'll go with the professors first. Pascal.
So one of my core research areas is speech recognition.
Yes.
So speech recognition, there are extremely noisy conditions. And we have colleagues in our field who have deployed directly a speech recognizer to a OCR, so to recognize text, handwritten text, like and it can be done with under noisy conditions. So this noise would be like the graphical noise, visualist, yeah.
Exactly.
And I wonder if you have colleagues who are doing that, because that seems to be a very critical step, the first step of digitizing, the converting all the handwritten manuscripts into text form. And Google is doing that, and I think that's very critical. And if you can do that and push that technology to work for this kind of document, I see a huge impact on documenting all these kind of historical archive in Europe, in China, everywhere else. I mean, that is the economic impact that you could have. And secondly is when you mentioned about the metadata. So my other area, I work with students on structural summarization. So when you read news, we automatically extract the title, subtitles, right? And Google does that too.
Yeah.
So, that sounds like something you could use as a quick and dirty method, automatic method to extract information from your aforementioned digitized, transcribed text to give a little subtitle. And then you can have humans browse through it. And I'm sure there are research that can be done to help you with metadata extraction. And these can be, again, applied to many other areas. Right?
Definitely. I mean, both are great comments. Can I quickly react? And I think it would be great to put our colleagues in touch. One comment would be in order to make this proof of concept compelling, you will have to be able to pick those very documents from these kind of archives which somehow have a relevance that goes beyond the very respectable but slightly narrow relevance for one single historian, for example. So it has to be something that has to do with the evolution of a city. So that's why, in addition to the technological challenge, we have a lot of discussions on which are the collections in these archives to prioritize for acquisition, because you also have, there is also a matter of interest. But absolutely, all of what you've said made total sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this. I mean, I'm extremely sympathetic to this. My advisor as a PhD student at Berkeley, Bob Walensky, was one of the pioneers of this sort of digital libraries 22 years ago. And so I have two questions, one sort of technical and one sort of educational. The technical thing that's a little bit thought-provoking and distressing
Great.
is that we were talking about the same issues 22, 23 years ago in terms of converting the text into something that we could actually search. Eden was, was asking about this.
Yeah.
You know, the types of language modeling techniques we're using in OCR and speech recognition and machine translation and so forth are still based on very crude models of language. And especially when the language has evolved over 1,000 years and you're dealing with handwriting and all sorts of domains. The problem is that the techniques that we're using still don't use the kind of computational linguistics models that have a lot more understanding built into them, which you need that contextual disambiguation to raise the accuracy. And not just that, going the other way, when you're actually trying to make use of that information, so the historian is trying to query the big data collections, if you know that you're interested in a specific entity, a specific name, sure, you can just search the 2.5 billion pages for that name. But you know, from a historian's point of view, their more interesting questions would be, for example, over the 1,000 years, the 2.5 billion pages of data, where in the history were people actually making an argument that said something like creative and humanistic endeavors that would have a positive socio-economic impact, right? Then the kind of keyword stuff doesn't work anymore, and there's too much of it in 2.5 billion. So I think that aspect of it really needs a lot of advances.
Thank you. Yes.
The educational right. The educational aspect of this that I also want to ask you about is, you know, sort of, so I work, you know, in computational linguistics and music technology, cognitive science, machine learning intersection. And our problem typically is, you know, that we get half our people from the engineering side, half our people from the humanities side. And the people coming from the humanities side try to learn about the engineering, but often the technical base, the mathematics, et cetera, isn't strong enough to get very far. And conversely, the engineering side, they can be very strong technically, but very little knowledge and interest in the humanities. What are your thoughts about, you know, you're creating this new program and hugely in support of this. What are your thoughts about how to tackle these problems?
Okay, to the great questions. I think to your first question, I think the question speaks for itself in the sense that yes. So no, in the sense that these are problems which the colleagues are trying to work on, and they know that, you know, exactly what you said. The techniques which are used are still, you know, still go back to you know, to several years ago. So there is nothing incredibly innovative yet. Also, I think an interesting point related to your question has to do with in the end, one of, you know, the opportunity of tracking the history of perceptions, tracking the history of how people used to see, you know, themselves, so used to see a city, you saw the history of taste, the history of behavior, down to the history of economic behavior, no? And that would require a level of sophistication of search which goes beyond looking for someone with, absolutely, and that will have to do with metadata and with, as summarization, exactly, as Pascal was saying, yes. To the question on education, and for a more specific answer, I'd be happy to create connections with my colleagues, because I think they would love to address this with you. For education, two things. One, yes, it's a form of there is a diversity of background which sometimes it's not a matter of how long it takes. Sometimes it's a matter that it just doesn't happen. And that's you can take it as a problem that you have to address, or you can try to expose these people together as groups to experiences which are very much field experiences, or kind of collaboration experiences which include elements of bootstrap that might usually, let me say, come from the technologists for the humanists as opposed to the other way around, because it is, as much as you would say the two categories are equals, but it is easier to find an engineer that is very passionate about art that finding a humanist or a art historian that is very passionate or gets it, in terms of the information system piece. At the same time, there are forms of literacy which are more and more natural, like coding, for example, which, although doesn't cover the entire spectrum of competency, but gives an exposure to this kind of areas which humanists until a while ago hadn't even thought about. Another way to address the issue has to do with the economic bottom line. So one of the efforts that we're trying to make is to connect as much as possible with all sorts of companies, both the obvious, like media and so on, and the ones less obvious, because it is through their feedback that you can through the feedback you can better articulate what kind of students you want to form. And then if you know what kind of students you want to form, you can also better explain to a humanist why she's supposed to take an extra year of classes, and we're not going to pay too much attention to the marks, but at least she has to sit down learning a couple of important things. And to a technologist that, he has to, even though I cannot force him to go to an exhibition or force him to, but I can certainly force him to think about this amazing opportunity of technology. Just think of when you can look at all the layers of painting in a painting, no? Well, do not just think about the chemistry of the materials, do not just think about different visualizations of the same painting according to how you analyze, but think about the history behind that painting. Why there was a rabbit in the garden, and then the Madonna in the other version did no longer have one rabbit, there were two rabbits, and so on. This is just an example I saw yesterday from Louvre. There is a Virgin with Rabbit by Tiziano that DMP, in collaboration with Louvre, has helped to literally disentangle. It's incredible what you can do. And so I hope, I'm not sure this answers your question entirely, but I hope it gives you a sense of the challenges that we think we're facing.
Well, HKUST is a perfect place for this kind of training and nurturing, since we have 4 very strong schools: science and engineering and business and humanities and social science. In fact, our Global China Studies. How many are Global China Studies students here? Well, I think Global China Studies has a lot of quantifying, quantification type studies. So maybe you can apply to go to EPFL to continue this work for Chinese manuscripts. Any questions here, please? Questions? Yes.
I wonder how you can apply what all these wonderful things and projects that's going on in Venus. I'm wondering if you've ever considered, applying it in other cultures, like maybe in China we've lost some of the historical documents in certain periods. Wondering if you've ever thought about, using the existing data to fill up the holes in history in other areas.
Yes, which is the underlying concept that Frederic is working on. So 2 things. The answer is yes. At the level of countries, there are countries that either have no archives because they simply do not have a tradition of keeping track of their history. Take, for example, the more recent Gulf states. And there are countries that have archives or have maybe repositories which might become archives, but that have not, for whatever reason, thought about organize them as archives. So a lot of them were burned. Yes. In that respect, an archive like the one of Venice is quite special, not necessarily because it is the largest, but because relatively to the size of the city and the information, it is one of the most of the best preserved. So it's almost like an experimental condition. The second thing I would like to say is that there are not states, but there are companies, business players that are more and more interested in doing something out of their archives. I'll just give you a few examples. I mentioned banks. Apparently, if you can better study the history of loans, so you can also better see the behavior of the borrowers and to better track the sufferings over time. Watchmakers, and I would say more in general, all the industry of luxury pay a lot of attention, partly for history of know-how, and partly for their marketing, to the amazing drawings and designs and letters exchanges with clients that they have in their either archives or repositories. in a totally different area, we are in touch with the Karen Gitai, who is in addition to, she's the daughter of Amos Gitai, the movie director, but what she's working on is the archive of the philologist who coniated the contemporary Hebrew. And guess what? The archive of this guy, which is one of the most important set of documents for Hebrew, is in a repository not even organized as an archive. It's like you go to, at your grandma's place, there is a bunch of documents from, I don't know, your grandpa's political activity. So it's just not brought to fruition yet. And as these examples, there are literally thousands. Now there is a problem of cost, right? Because one of the situations in which we are now is that we have an increasing number of individuals, families, companies contacting us asking to digitize their archive, because we become slightly more popular than others when it comes to archives. But that doesn't mean that we have become, an archival machinery, because that is very expensive. So there is not so much consciousness about the cost of these kind of things, what you would really do with these kind of things. So what you want to avoid is to start projects and then end up, because they are, end up with ill-conceived things, projects that you now have to implement, no matter they are not going well. So it's an interesting area with pitfalls also.
Yes, question here. Over here first, please.
Thank you. That was a wonderful presentation, and as a historian, I could say that I'm extremely excited by it, and it sounds like there are amazing resources that can be made from it. It seems like there's sort of parallels that one could be drawn between this kind of big data project and something like the Human Genome Project. Both are trying to put together huge data sets without necessarily knowing at the onset what kind of answers may come out of it. But one difference, I'm not a biologist, so I'm trying to just sort of conjecture this, but is that there is a sort of theory of gene transcription, that people sort of know that even though there are vast amounts of genetic data that you may never figure out what it means, that there are homologies and sort of models that you can use to kind of figure out what these code into. Whereas historians are constantly inventing new questions and constantly trying to create new models to understand things that people 50, 20 years ago never even thought were important. So I was kind of wondering, when you're trying to market a project like this, to convince people that exciting new results will come out of it, are there particular kinds of questions that you think it can lead us to ask that we may never have asked before, or if it will just facilitate, not just minimizing, but it will facilitate finding answers that people have been looking for before, but just in a much more efficient way?
Thank you. You touch a very critical point. Let me offer maybe a couple of possible perspectives. First of all, it is, when we talk about this project, we tend to use a comparison with projects like the DNA, a recent project EPFL is leading about the mapping out the brain. Okay. But we have to keep in mind that the level of attention, for example, on the side of governments or sponsors for projects that have to do in a way or another with health or with discovering biology, discovering brain science, are more prone to capture the attention of the public. So if you try to sell the project of the DNA of history, and I say that very honestly, sometimes the only real thing that you manage to sell is that Venice is so beautiful. So at least you get these people to see the archives, but then it doesn't mean that you have full support. So then on the sustainability side, at the level of historians, we have two. Maybe it's a bit simplistic, but might boil down to two categories. You have those who haven't even thought about it. So take, anecdote, but Steven Greenblatt, for example, was somebody that, although paying attention to the technological development, had never thought about this notion of having everything digitized. And then you have those who have been doing quite a lot of, let's call it digital humanities, let's call it whatever you want. Digital humanities is a loose definition in a sense. And the advantage with the second group is that they are more or less up to speed with technology, but the disadvantage is that they have often started to look at those, to formulate their questions at the time when technology was totally separate from the daily life of a researcher. Whereas today, you don't think about, okay, life is on one side and on one end, and the computer may or may not be on the other end. It's kind of, we are the same. So paradoxically, but this is purely based on anecdotal conversations, the scholars which, in our view, might have the highest potential are the ones which maybe come from a more traditional background and that can get up to speed potentially relatively more rapidly with what is now available. To some extent, a comparison you could attempt is with the boom of online courses, no? So, which somehow has been following a similar time frame of digital humanities, the last 25 years or so, 30 years. And until the MOOCs exploded, a lot of people had been working so hard, so much, invested so much money in online education, with results which were quite mixed, frankly. Now, I don't want to open a discussion about the impact of MOOCs, okay? But the point is that there was a tipping point because the MOOCs triggered a much broader discussion on educational reform, which, whatever you think of MOOCs, is very useful. But why that started, one of the reasons at least, was that all the different pieces of technology which were available to online education had come together in a way that made it definitely more simple and more compelling, especially for a generation of digital, of born digital. We could go on and on with this conversation, but I think you touch on a very, very sensitive topic. The problem with those who come from a stronger tradition in the digital application in the digital humanities, the problem sometimes is that they find hard to articulate the new research questions because they risk to lose the innocent curiosity which you might find instead in those who are totally ignorant in the area.
Okay, John.
Yeah. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. You start with a wonderful map. Okay, it's beautiful. Okay, so my questions relate to maps. So any team in your group that start to do some digitizing, it's not just scanning, but changing the maps into database of population, of industrialization, all sorts of things, so people can can actually do search, do analysis, quickly, instead of going through thousands of pages of maps, etc. Okay.
The answer is yes, even though there is not a colleague at the moment working on that piece of the in the augmentation of the capacity to study economic history. So there is the colleague who was studying who studies the routes of the Empire of Venice, who also tries to apply GIS technology and so kind of maps to enhance the information. But I confess we don't have much expertise in that. But it is part of, but nevertheless there is a kind of expertise that is not totally revolutionary. So you can find it in other universities probably. But I think you raise an interesting point also that has to do with how compelling at the end of the day the type of products, the type of material that can come out of all these efforts can be.
Maybe one last question, if there's any. Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, I see your demonstration, the global network, the shipping roads, shipping lanes.
Yes.
As a, from the perspective of anthropologist, I see it's possible to read the human social boundary, but can it also read migration trajectory to see the...
I think it's a wonderful area, and not just that, there is a lot of interest, which I think is relevant to your question, in the history of maritime networks. With a stronger focus on commercial aspects, but with a focus on circulation of people throughout history. So there is, for example, there are colleagues in Singapore who are very interested in the history of ports and how how you can look at the history of humankind through data from essentially port authorities and so on. And that's why they wanted to involve us because we worked on probably one of the most famous port authorities in history, which is Venice. But I think the answer is yes. It's a very pertinent implication.
Maybe let me ask the last question.
Please.
Do you have funding to take graduate students for this project?
Well, part of there are a lot of master students, actually, which touches on the question, the technologists and the humanists, that there is an increasing number of master students that are taking courses in relation to humanities. Some of them because they love Venice, back to what I was saying, but some of them because they are honestly interested in exploring. And so part of that talent is comes to us as part of the standard functioning of the university. To the question whether we have money for graduates, we are working on it, I have to say. So I hope that before the summer we will have a sense of how much we can get on top of what we as an institution will be willing to invest in this kind of project.
Well, okay, maybe some of our students here in the audience.
But absolutely, we would be
or
delighted
postgraduate
to have students visiting, and arrangements would be possible.
And also, I think you would get more money working on Venice than if you were working on the archives of Manchester or
Exactly.
Pittsburgh.
So I have set up the joint EPFL HKUST Masters in Computer Science. Would students in that program be eligible to help work on this?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think so. Yes. I guess some of them participated in the Frederic Carlon's courses.
Well, anyway,
I don't
Michele,
have the names, but
Michele, thank you very much for a fascinating
thank
presentation.
you for the invitation.
And we welcome you to come back, and I hope that some of you go visit not just Venice, but EPFL in Lausanne, a beautiful campus with water just like ours outside their door and their windows. Thank you very much all for coming today.
Thank you so much.